Hello and welcome to this, our second class on the book of Revelation, Apocalypse as Hope. And if you read the book before, that may be a surprise to you that we are subtitling it Apocalypse as Hope. But the word apocalypse does not mean the end of the world, as we discussed last week. And this is a book of hope. And you will, I think, come around to that way of thinking as we proceed through this class over the course of the coming months. As I was saying, this is the second class. Last week's was on our own stories regarding the book of Revelation, how the book has interacted and intersected with our own lives. Some of us had quite a lot of experience with the book, some of us had none at all, and then there was everything in between, and it was quite a good discussion. This week, we are going to talk about the origins of the genre of literature itself, which is Hebrew Apocalyptic Literature. The book of Revelation comes from a genre called Hebrew Apocalyptic Literature, except in regards to the book of Revelation, it's written in a Christian context, but drawing from the same ways, and it's from the same genre, as we'll discuss as we move forward. Well, what is apocalyptic literature broadly, and what is Hebrew apocalyptic literature? And before we answer that question, we first should consider its origins. Hebrew apocalyptic literature is a genre of writing that developed during the exilic and post-exilic periods of Jewish history. Apocalyptic literature developed out of a different, although connected, genre of writing, the prophetic writings. So it would be helpful to think of apocalyptic writings as a subgenre of the prophetic writings. These prophetic writings were written roughly between the year 750 BCE and 350 BCE. These years span the conquest of Judah and Israel by the Assyrians, which happened between 750 through 700 BCE. Then the Babylonian conquest of the Assyrians and further subjugation of the Hebrews between the years 586, 87, roughly, through 538, which was the year that the Persians threw out the Babylonians and would hold control for the next 200 years, frankly. And the occupation of Israel Palestine would continue after the Persians with the regional conquest of Alexander the Great, the great Greek conqueror. You may have heard of him. And then came the Romans. All of this to say the prophetic writings were written during periods of great violence, calamity, and uncertainty. Of these writings, biblical scholars Louis Stolman and Hyun Chol Paul Kim write, the prophetic corpus is ultimately survival literature for exiles of old and exiles today. Here to your right is painting from medieval times of some of these exiles. Looks on their face of great uncertainty, trepidation, trying to maintain status, trying to maintain place, whilst also being navigated and moved around by foreign occupiers, leading to great uncertainty. And it's out of that uncertainty that the prophetic literature would arrive, and then consequently the apocalyptic literature. It's important to remember that Hebrew prophetic writings were written, as I was saying, in the context of great loss, pain, and anxiety. Of this, Stolman and Kim write, written prophecy is a mediation of the horror of war and its devastating repercussions. Not unlike contemporary art, it dares to broach the abyss with candor and fractured beauty. It courageously comes face to face with a world of disarray and fraught with moral ambiguity, and it refuses to retreat into denial. Otherwise, its social and symbolic constructions would scarcely resonate with disenfranchised communities eking out life on the edges of time and space. Now, much confusion has been generated around this word prophet. Today, a prophet is thought of as one who makes predictions, hopefully accurately, about the future. Reducing the prophet's role to fortune teller is to miss the nature and meaning of the role. Prophets, in a nutshell, were not really predictors of the future. They spoke about future possibilities in order to make sense of the present. The Hebrew word for prophet is navi, which means to proclaim, mention, call, or summon. So the prophet was thought of as one who would proclaim the viewpoint and intentions of God. They were social critics, naming what was broken in society. They were political reformers calling for change from the top down. They castigated the royal and priestly classes alike, naming corruption in high places. They were also poets, which is why much of their writings reads with such vivid imagery and language, powerful explosions, mountains shaking, fire, flames, and heartache. They were poets too. And they were religious philosophers. Questions of evil and God's providence were certainly in the mix as they would try to contemplate the questions around their captivity and their exiles. Why would this happen? But then they would also write of possible futures for the people. Sometimes these came in the form of dire predictions. But one of the tendencies of the prophets, if not their hallmark, was to imagine a future on the other side of their current calamity, a bright future full of every good thing. It is perhaps for this reason that they are sometimes thought of as fortune or future tellers, but the possible futures they saw were by no means certain. Even from the perspective of some of the prophets, they knew this. In the Hebrew prophetic writings and the canonical writings, there are three larger works of prophecy. We know these well: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then there are the 12, or as we call them, minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And these all 12 were traditionally included on one scroll because of their brevity, being very practical there. Christians have included Lamentations in the book of Daniel under the heading of prophetic works, but in Hebrew circles, and we're sticking with what Hebrew prophetic literature is here, these have historically been held under the subheading writings. But still, the themes contained therein are similar, so I see why Christians lump them in. But what did they write, these prophets? Well, they wrote of the gut-wrenching devastation of war, of their families butchered and their homes destroyed. They wrote of the poor and wicked leadership that made the conquest more likely. In other words, they provided biting social commentary addressed to their nation's leaders and citizens generally. In these writings, they castigate those in power who have become godless and corrupt. They wrote of the devastating consequences of failing to live into God's vision for the people. But despite it all, they often wrote of a bright future, one in which the people would turn from their evil ways and things would be set to right. The land would be restored and society would flourish in new and unprecedented ways. But in terms of the gut-wrenching things they would write about, and look no further than this stylist to your right. A stylist was a victory marker that was put up to talk about the conquests of the king. And here you have the Assyrians leading captives away from their homelands. And if you look very carefully, you may see that they are bound by their lips. At least that's often how they're portrayed, being led by a chain. And you see the captor behind with the sort of rod leading them. These are not people who are choosing their own ways. These are people who have lost volition. And it was to these people and others people that the prophets wrote. For example, here's some stock prophetic literature from Micah chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. This would be written near the beginning of the Assyrian captivity of Israel and Judah. And it writes, "Woe is me! For I have become like one who, after the summer fruit has been gathered, after the vintage has been gleaned, finds no cluster to eat. There is no first ripe fig for which I hunger. The faithful have disappeared from the land, and there is no one left who is upright. They all lie in wait for blood, and they hunt each other with nets. Their hands are skilled to do evil. The official and the judge ask for a bribe, and the powerful dictate what they desire. Thus they pervert justice. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright of them a thorn hedge. The day of their sentinels, of their punishment, has come. Now their confusion is at hand. Put no trust in a friend. Have no confidence in a loved one. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your embrace. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies are members of your own household. But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me." Now I included verse 7 of Micah chapter 7 as a for instance of a prophet leaning, however cautiously, into a hopeful future for the people. I'll read that line again. But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. This is a cue into the audience that Mike is writing to do likewise and to hold on for this day of salvation. Writing of this, writes Stolman and Kim, though their lives have been turned upside down, the text is still adamant that Yahweh reigns and will one day deliver exiles from their oppressor. The interpretive community punctuates the scroll with the prospect of better times. Their insistence on a better future for the people stemmed from their assumptions about God's love and justice. It can only be this way in the mind of the prophet, because if God is just and loving, then this cannot continue. A just God should not allow evil to overrun the world. From the Hebrew perspective in exile, this is what has momentarily happened. But a just and faithful God will not allow things to continue this way. Or as the minor prophet Zephaniah writes, at that time I will bring you home. And at that time, when I gather you, for I will make you renowned and praised. When I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says the Lord. Telling of a time when things will be set to right. And here I have this little clip of this little child in a cape to try to give us the feeling of victory and conquest over evil. However unlikely, Mighty Mouse wins. Frodo from Lord of the Rings gets the ring to where it needs to be and destroys it. Victory, in other words. So that was prophetic literature. What is apocalyptic literature? After all, that is what we're talking about. The book of Revelation being one kind of writing that fits within that genre. Well, that's broadly speaking prophetic literature. What is apocalyptic literature, this subgenre that comes out of prophetic literature? Well, here we will rely on biblical scholar and writer James M. Efford, who wrote this book I mentioned last week called Left Behind, What the Bible Really Says About the End Times. And before I read an extended quote, I'll just say, during the occupation and influence of the Persian Empire, a new genre of literature was developing out of the prophetic writings, apocalyptic literature. And I'll here remind you that apocalypse does not mean the end of the world, or really the end of anything. Rather, it means something uncovered or revealed. And with that in mind, I'd like to quote extensively from James M. Efford's book, Left Behind, What the Bible Really Says About the End Times. And here quoting, the apocalyptic writing movement, which began in post-exilic Judaism between 200 and 300 BC, or 300, 200 BC, respectively, was at first a thought pattern that developed a literary style to serve as a vehicle for speaking to persecuted people. At base, the apocalyptic ideology held that a cosmic battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil was taking place in the world. Since the earth is part of the cosmic order, the battle also rages within human history, and people are called up to ally themselves with one side or the other. In apocalyptic literature, there is little room for gray areas. The battle, it was believed, would be long and hard. There were times when good had the upper hand, and there were times when the two sides were nearly even. But there were also times when evil had the upper hand, and in such situations, those on the good side suffered and were persecuted. Even though it was thought that there would be a final end to all this conflict and that good would ultimately triumph over evil, the Hebrew concept of history kept the people from thinking of only one great conflict at the end. The idea of Jewish apocalyptic writing centered on ages, specifically a present age that had come under the dominion of the forces of evil that could only be redeemed by the intervention of God. God alone would take away the persecution and restore the people to a quote-unquote normal life. This led to the idea of a two-age system in Jewish thought, a present age under the dominion of the forces of evil, and soon to come new age in which persecution would be removed. The main point to remember is that history continues to move along, and in the course of events, a new period of evil may be born, thus repeating the cycle again. Continuing this rather lengthy quote from James Efford. Since the Jewish community in Palestine had returned from exile in Babylon in 538 BC, their lot had been anything but good. They were politically powerless, economically poor, and militarily vulnerable to any who decided to come into their area and loot or pillage. It is no wonder that apocalyptic thinking became part of the people's mindset during this stage of their existence. To facilitate the dissemination of these ideas, a literary style was created, characterized by the use of strange symbols and images. For people who were part of that culture and time, these symbols and images were readily recognizable, much in the same way as people today recognize the meaning of political cartoons. No one has to explain the grotesque figures and images to us. Most people know their intent because they employ a literary device common to our culture and time. In apocalyptic symbolism, beasts stood for nations. Heads on beasts represented rulers. Numbers had specific but symbolic meanings. So did colors. In any apocalyptic work, as with any biblical book, the interpreters must know something about the historical setting in which the book was written so as to interpret the book as the inspired author intended. That was, as I said, a lengthy quote from James Efford's book on the Left Behind concept. He passed away about 5 years ago. Rest in peace. All this to say, this last point will be important for us to remember as we progress. For much interpretation on the book of Revelation in these modern times has been done void of its original context and with little to no understanding of the symbols employed and their meanings at that time. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Here are the key features of apocalyptic literature versus prophetic, or rather, in contrast to prophetic, I should rather say. While the prophetic literature does insist on moral categories, the lines between them are less clear. For example, some of the prophets laud kings that others castigate. In apocalyptic literature, there is little moral ambiguity. The world is divided in stark lines between the righteous and the unrighteous, the wicked and the upright, the light and the dark. So while you might get some nuance with the prophets about who is really responsible or culpable, you don't get that kind of nuance with apocalyptic literature. While prophetic literature is aware of the tension between good and evil in the world, apocalyptic literature describes the conflict on a cosmic scale. The very forces of God and Satan arrayed in heavenly combat. Here is a top-down battle that influences every sphere of the divine and creation. And while prophetic literature has a more linear understanding of history, moving from past to present and then a possible future, apocalyptic literature thinks of history in terms of cycles or ages. In apocalyptic writing, the prophet assumes that they are living in a wicked age, an age totally in thrall to the forces of Satan and evil. And once you realize that books like Revelation are not written along a linear timeline, but are rather seeing the courses of human history as occurring in cycles, it makes a lot more sense. Why else bring in all of the imagery from previous empires like Babylon when you're in the time of Rome, if not to show the cycles? Or why not liken Babylon to Egypt, if not to show the cycles and the repetitive patterns of human empire, human depravity, violence, evil, and the eventual conquest of that evil? But going on, apocalyptic literature uses symbolism and metaphor to unveil deep truths, far more so than prophetic literature. While prophetic literature leans into a hopeful future, apocalyptic literature describes not only the nature of this future, a new heavens and a new earth, but also the seismic process by which God will bring about the conclusion of the old/evil age and the advent of the new/restored age. While prophetic literature may foresee a positive future for the people, apocalyptic literature all but guarantees a positive future. Its function is to instill hope in the hearts of a persecuted people during terrible times. While prophetic literature does not describe in detail how God will bring about the sweeping changes necessary for a new heavens and a new earth, apocalyptic literature often includes a messianic figure empowered by God to bring about the necessary transformations in our world. and also in the heavens. The book of Daniel is the quintessential Hebrew apocalyptic text. Here is one that we Christians have borrowed from and we riff from in the book of Revelation, and it's quoted in places like that. But as a standalone by itself, as a work in and of itself, it is a good example of Hebrew apocalyptic literature that maybe we are more familiar with. There are other apocalyptic texts the Hebrews would center their attention around that are not in the Jewish/Christian canons, but this one is, and that's why I would like to bring it up as a good example of it. It was composed in the tradition of the prophet Daniel around 165 BCE, so this would be after many, many centuries of violent conquest, and this was during the time of the Greek occupation. Here is a writing from Daniel 8 that includes an element that will be crucial to understanding apocalyptic thought around the time of Jesus, as well as interpreting early Christian apocalyptic writings. Here I'm reading from the book of Daniel, chapter 8, starting with verse 18 and on through verse 27. And here the prophet is speaking to us. As he was speaking to me, I fell into a trance, face to the ground. Then he touched me and set me on my feet. He said, "Listen, and I will tell you what will take place in the period of wrath, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the power and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall be great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken, and not by human hands. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. And as for you, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now." So I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, but I was dismayed by the vision and did not understand it. Notice the short phrase at the end of verse 25, "But he shall be broken and not by human hands." The he mentioned here is a passing reference to a messianic figure that the Jewish apocalyptic writings will continue to include. Here is one sent from the divine who will be God's instrument to overthrow the powers of evil on earth. This one, or the Son of Man, as you may have heard them called, as he will be also referred to here in Daniel 7, will be a human ruler empowered by God to throw off the powers of evil that have long held the people in their grips. And here is a good example of apocalyptic literature in that the symbolism is quite clear. It specifically says that 2 horns on this ram are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat, the king of Greece, with a great horn between its eyes, that's Alexander the Great, who upon his death, the kingdom was divided between the generals and those that had helped him create the empire in the first place. We see that reflected in verse 22. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall rise from his nation, but not with his power. Keep in mind, this was written after this had already occurred, but it's written from the perspective of Daniel, put in the context of the Persian and Babylonian empires to help us see that in the current circumstance, when the Greeks are in control, when this book Daniel was written, we can have hope. Because there was once a man named Daniel who, in thrall to similar empires, found a way to live faithfully in that time. That's the point. Now, what about Jesus? Apocalypticism and Jesus. We just touched on a text written about 165, 70 years before Jesus was born. And by the time Jesus was born, apocalyptic literature had risen in popularity and appeal. It's not surprising, as these writings offered them hope, over and against their harsh surroundings and the suffering that they endured. I'm not surprised that this kind of writing would become popular in the context of suffering and hardship, as it would give you some way to keep your head up high. Apocalyptic writings that were available around the time of Jesus include some proto apocalyptic works, meaning we're starting to turn the corner into this new genre, found in Isaiah chapters 24 through 27, chapter 33, and then also chapters 34 through 35. The book of Jeremiah has a smattering of apocalyptic work in chapter 33, verses 14 through 26. The 38th and 39th chapters of Ezekiel are apocalyptic in their genre and composition. In the book of Joel, we have a passage in the third chapter, verses 9 through 17, and the Zechariah 12 through 14. And one that's thoroughly apocalyptic, as was being discussed, that was available at the time of Jesus, was the book of Daniel, especially chapters 7 through 12. Daniel is a composite of various works, one of them being this apocalyptic literature that we were just studying. But also at the same time as Jesus was alive, there were non-canonical works. These were works that were being used for teaching and instruction in synagogues and places where Jesus might have gone, but didn't make it into the solidified canon or the official list of approved scriptural readings, or held up as inspired in the way that others are. And here I have an extended list. I'm not going to read all of them, touch on a few of the names just to give you a feel for the tenor of these things. You can even draw from the titles: Apocalypse of Abraham, Apocalypse of Adam, of Moses, Aramaic Apocalypse, Gabriel's Revelation. You may know the angel Gabriel from the nativity stories. Anyway, these are different apocalypses, and we're going to consider one that came later before the end of this. Put a pin in that. Well, Jesus, though, all this to say, was well familiar with these works. We know this because his theology was shot through with thoughts of the apocalyptic prophets. He quoted them and even taught with apocalyptic language himself. Just read Matthew 24, and you can read Jesus' own words in an apocalyptic framing. He believed that he was living during an evil age that would soon come to an end. He saw himself as the arbiter of this change. He referred to himself as the Son of Man, a reference to Daniel's apocalypse, the one who would be the catalyst to bring about the change. But he seems to have added a twist which would influence the beliefs of his contemporaries, as well as spark a new movement within Judaism. In Luke chapter 17, verses 20 through 21, are described this twist to which I'm referring, and here it is quoted. Once Jesus was asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God was coming, that is, the new age coming. When will it break in? And Jesus answered, the realm of God is not coming with things that can be observed, nor will they say, look, here it is, or there it is, for in fact, the realm of God is among you. Here, the apocalypse, if it can be described as a singular event, is happening around Jesus in real time. Instead of seeing humanity divided into two ages, neat and tidy, the old, the new, the evil, the righteous, the light, and the dark, Jesus sees the lines between these ages as blurred. He sees himself as the one who brings the realm of God, or this new age, with him to share with his disciples and anyone else who would put their faith in his way. However, the work is not yet complete. We are somewhere in between the old age and the new. Still today we think of it like this. The twilight years of the old age and the golden dawn of the new. The cosmic battle continues to rage, but the end result is as reliable as God's nature, trustworthy and just. The apocalyptic writers want us to know that God will see all of creation through to the life that it was made for. Now, roughly here is where we ended this lesson the first go around about 4 years ago. But in preparation for this, I stumbled upon a apocalyptic work that became popular in the 7th century Common Era. It is 700 years after Jesus, when in another period of tumult and calamity, this time in Europe, Jewish followers were trying to understand how to live and what to hope for in the midst of great societal upheaval, specifically the rise of Islam and the conquest of Islamic imperialism throughout the region. This is called Zephyr Zerubbabel, the Apocalypse of Zerubbabel. It's an early medieval Jewish apocalyptic text from, as I said, the 7th century. It was written during a time, as I was saying, of political upheaval and foreign domination. It presents a vision given to Zerubbabel through angelic revelation. It reads, and I'm quoting, "These are the things that shall befall at the end of days." And here, don't hear the end of the world, but rather the end of an old age, which is about to fall in the coming of a new age when things are set to right. Like other apocalyptic writings, it uses symbolism, visions, and cosmic imagery to interpret present crises through divine disclosure. It reflects a community wrestling with suffering, identity, and hope. This kind of writing will feel familiar. If you've been reading Revelation, you'll have encountered lines like "I saw," or "at that time," or "it came to pass" to mark these transitions. This writing has similar phrasing, but it does not stand alone. It belongs to a wider world of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic writing. What we've been talking about is the writing that came before, and some of what is in this newer text draws from books like 3 Enoch, visions of the angel Metatron, which is one of the characters in this apocalypse. By the way, just Google Sefer Zerubbabel, and you can find translations of the text. You can read for yourself, fairly short. But then also the Apocalypse of Abraham, which I don't think you probably have read, but it was one that was around the time of Jesus making circulations for Ezra to Baruch. Um, and of course, there are Christian parallels from the same period. This is very interesting. At the same time as we have this new apocalyptic text from within Judaism, called the Apocalypse of Zerubbabel, we have other Christian apocalypses being written that didn't really take on, but probably helped serve in the midst of struggle. Specifically, one here mentioned is Apocalypse of Pseudo Methodius. This was similar to Zerubbabel's apocalypse, written to help the reader cope with the struggles and tumult that came with the rise of the Islamic Empire. These texts all interpret present events as part of a cosmic struggle. For example, in the Apocalypse of Zerubbabel, we read, "A king shall arise, and he shall afflict Israel greatly." Compare that with Revelation 13, where it says, "The beast was allowed to make war on the saints." The beast here being a symbolic figure representing oppressive imperial power, as the king in Zerubbabel's apocalypse does. So these are not isolated ideas, but part of a shared apocalyptic imagination across communities, and here up through the first millennia after Jesus was born. This book I ran across in my studies because I think that others have noted, as well as I experienced, that it helps us read Revelation more clearly. Gives us another rubric or another example and another time where the same way of approaching the text will help us illumine its meaning, understand its meaning. It shows that apocalyptic writing responds to a real historical crisis, as was true in the 7th century, or in Jesus' time, or before. It uses symbolic language to describe present realities, and it moves from suffering toward hope. And here, to my right, is an imagining of what the new temple would look like when restored, the third temple. You can see to the right there, the bottom complex would be where we now have what's known as the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, will be right up against this square. And then on top of that, you see the temple proper made. But this was a rendering of what it might look like when it's restored. I include it to make the point that those who are reading Zerubbabel's Apocalypse would have in mind this sort of thing happening. Once the cosmic battle of evil and good had shaken out, good triumphing and providing a stable environment for the people to live. So we can compare a few lines. In Revelation 21, we read, "He shall make war with the saints," he being the instrument of destruction, we'll talk more about in another time. And then, after, see, in the book of Revelation writes, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth." So there's war that breaks into a new heaven and a new earth. The same pattern appears across traditions. Zephyr Cerubbabel does for Jewish communities what the book of Revelation does for early Christians, and what later texts like Pseudo Methodius do for Christians under new empires. The purpose is not fear, but endurance. Not prediction for its own sake, but hope in the midst of suffering. Apocalypse is not about the end of the world, but about God's faithfulness within it. And next week, as we consider the origins of the book of Revelation itself in a Christian context, we will see the ways in which this book was a help to its original audience to help them live with courage in the face of much that would lay them low. Speaking of that next class, it will be Tuesday, May the 12th, 2026, at 6:30. Same time, same place as this one, the Northwood Library. If you're watching this online before this class or before the class or after the class that's to occur tonight, May the 5th, just let you know we're meeting again. But also we have these videos available for those who would like to either brush up on what was taught before or to experience it for the first time or to catch up. Or if you have to miss the class, you can stay up to date by watching these videos. The next class will be, as I said, on the origins of Revelation. And here I'm going to turn to my bibliography. These are the sources from which I have drawn. We have primary texts to the left, citing several of these apocalypses as I've been discussing, either the ones that are in the canon or ones that were left out for whatever reason. And then I've got these commentaries, scholarly works, one that I quoted from at length. They're the second one. James F. Effort, Left Behind, What the Bible Really Says About the End Times, is one that I recommend. You might Google it and see if you can find yourself a copy. And then here's some additional resources. There is Great Courses, Teaching Company Great Courses series on the Apocalypse, a DVD series of 20-some lessons. It's very good. I very much learned. I learned a lot from it. And then a few of the sources I consulted even today to learn about this book, Zephyr Zerubbabel, or the Apocalypse of Zerubbabel. In any case, I encourage you to check these things out and to go over our schedule that's coming up. You can take a screenshot of this if that's the way you'd like to add it to your calendar, or just look it over to get your mind around where we're heading. This week, Apocalypse in Jewish literature. Next week, the origins of Revelation. And then we'll be getting to the text itself, starting with the first 3 chapters and the 7 churches mentioned therein. And once we get there, we will be rolling. So more on that to come. I hope to see you next week, and until then, God bless.